I had no idea that second would alter the course of my life in such a profound way. Up until I entered that room, it was just another typical day. Something inside of me changed the second I saw the door ajar. It was an option. I could have gone back. But I didn't. I knew then and there that my world would never be the same when I saw what I was looking at. I was the one responsible as I initiated the situation and failed to intervene when necessary. Working George was. I could make out some faint sounds coming from upstairs in the otherwise silent house. In his room Elliot was. Initially, I didn't give it any consideration. Another instance of a young man oblivious to reality. Maybe he'd prefer coffee though. Having a brief chat could be pleasant. Attempting to pinpoint the source of the noises, I made my way up the stairs. The door to his room was slightly ajar as I approached it. I was going to yell out to him when I caught sight of Elliot, so I paused to collect my thoughts. He sat on his bed, laptop resting on his lap, and the light from the screen illuminated his face. I assumed he was only watching something interesting because his hands were moving. Perhaps an action flick? However, I felt the blood dripping from my face as I continued to walk back and adjust my angle. At that same second, I understood Elliot's plan. As soon as I laid eyes on the screen reflection, a chill ran down my spine. This is beyond my expectations. This is not what I had hoped to see. In a mad dash to calm himself, Elliot quickly turned down the volume on his laptop. But by then it had passed. That had transpired before. There was an obvious look of humiliation in his eyes as his cheeks flushed scarlet as our gazes connected. He began before averting his gaze. I was paralyzed with fear. Excuse me. The entranceway. I began, although I was completely unsure of my intended meaning. A peculiar feeling of warmth washed over me. Sure, I felt ashamed, but my thoughts were also racing with things I didn't understand. My heart was thumping, so I bolted out of the room. In an effort to calm my racing heart, I brought my palms up to my face. Please tell me what that was. To myself I murmured. What on earth did I just do? Why was I being so irresponsible? However though, am I the only one responsible for this? Darlene, I told myself in a harsh voice, stop it. However, my inner turmoil. It wasn't merely my observations that set it off. Elliot had reached the age of 23. No longer was he a child. Still, I was 47 years old and a woman who had felt her share of humiliation. This was the first time I had ever felt shame, but I had been in similar situations before. My heart was still racing as I stood motionless in the corridor. As I struggled to gather myself, I ran my fingers through my hair. Elliot straightened his shirt collar, cleared his throat, and kept his eyes averted as he arrived at the doorway. My name is Darlene. Oh, my apologies. I thought I had closed the door, he remarked with a genuine yet uncertain tone. In a flash, I averted my gaze and shook my head. Sure, actually, it is my fault. I should express my apologies. Hurriedly, I said. I should have knocked before coming in. I didn't know what else to say. No sound. The silence, though, was unusual. Even though we'd shared a residence for a long time, this was our first mutually intimate glance. This was the first occasion that we had any sort of conflict. With a swift motion toward the stairs, I declared that I needed to get dinner started, so I headed downstairs. Despite my best efforts, my voice was quivering. Elliot remained silent and watched me intently, as if he were attempting to make sense of something. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, enable notifications, and listen to this story all the way to the finish before Elliot and I started having major stuff happen. I assure you things are about to get thrilling. We had remained silent until that evening. Strictly no texting, gazing, or small chat. Whatever the case may be, that stillness betrayed the impending change. We were seated at the same table for dinner, but we avoided making eye contact. The sound of silverware clinking against our plates was the sole audible sound. We were both aware that a conversation was necessary to alleviate the tension. The question is, how? The hours that followed that night were filled with passing events. It appeared like everything was normal, but it wasn't. The unspoken tension between us intensified as a result of our lack of communication. Eventually, Elliot joined me in my chair one afternoon. His reluctance to commit made it quite evident that he wanted to make things right. The other day, Darlene, I felt terribly ashamed. It's my deepest regret that things have turned out this way, Please, I really don't want this to damage our relationship, he said, his voice anxious yet genuine. I drew a long breath. Regardless of how out of the ordinary this was, I had to reassure him. Oh, Elliot, believe me, I've had my fair share of embarrassing moments over the years, I answered while smiling and somewhat shrugging. Then I told him about some of those situations. With a tiny relief from his humiliation, he nodded and his smile softened. There was a noticeable release of tension between us in that instant. Yet I was aware in my heart. It seemed as if time had stood still. This discussion had totally dissolved any barriers that may have existed between us, despite the fact that things appeared to be improving. I could sense that things were going to take a significant leap forward. With a sigh, Elliot drew his eyes down to the table. His words were muted, yet they conveyed the idea that they should be taken seriously. I cocked my head to look at him. Can you explain? Curiosity beginning to seep into my voice, I inquired. His countenance briefly changed, as if he had suddenly come to the realization that his words were irretrievable. He hesitated for a second before rubbing the nape of his neck. However, he had already begun. He was now forced to proceed without further delay. Under his breath he whispered, I've seen you, and then he averted his gaze. Very much so. You were simply unaware of it. A surge of excitement coursed through my entire being. My body went into a stasis. Excuse me? The pressure of his words was so great that I could only speak in a low voice. Despite his reddening cheeks, Elliot persisted. I was too ashamed to tell you, so I kept it to myself. However, I kept thinking about it. In fact, it was a small secret of mine. Some thought that would not leave my mind. I was experiencing a rapid heartbeat. I felt the unfamiliar comfort that comes from knowing something has altered. It was as if something had shifted. The words Elliot spoke broke down all the barriers that had been between us. They were more than a confession. My gaze fell upon him, and he was staring at me as well. Furthermore, at this point, we were both aware that this was no ordinary discussion. Everything had changed, and the room's air had grown heavy. It was on that day when things began to shift. Before, there was always some space between us. We were separated by that unseen line. At this point, though, it seemed as though the boundary had entirely disappeared. I began to spend an inordinate amount of time with Elliot without even noticing it. Quiet times, apparently meaningless chats. But the truth is that all of them did was make things more tense between us. At this point, we even watched movies side by side. We used to keep our distance from each other constantly, but now, we were drawn together silently. A shared emotion that went unacknowledged by both of us. Something off-kilter would happen to me every time Elliot put his arm on the couch, my hand touched his leg, or our laughing entwined. I made an effort, nevertheless, to ignore the incident. I had trouble sleeping one night. In bed I kept turning and tossing. However, I couldn't let myself be because of the restlessness inside. I was completely preoccupied with one thing. Elliot, good day. This was unsustainable. I had to establish some limits. I had to be honest and tell him if he felt anything for me so he could quit. I rolled out of bed thinking about that. My pulse was racing at an alarming rate. Still, I was already in Elliot's room, thanks to my feet. A crack in his door let in a glimmer of light, casting a soft glow across the room. I noticed him the second I went inside. He was sound asleep. However, I wasn't staring at him at that same moment. Their attention was entirely diverted. Somewhere perhaps, a large. I gasped for air. A moment later my entire body froze. A tempest raged within of me at seeing him in such state. Seeing it was a mistake. I should have gone backwards like a bolt of lightning. However, I chose not to. For a few seconds I just stood there, attempting to make sense of my emotions. After that I drew back swiftly. I had to push off an uncontrollable feeling that was nagging at me. Nothing felt familiar when I got back to my room and lay asleep. I had no clue things would get so much trickier that night. I tried so hard to fight off our developing friendship, but Elliot always managed to pull me in. As time went on, the lines between them became ever less distinct. Our attraction to one another intensified. It had even escaped my notice when things had escalated to this point. However, I was aware of one thing. It was getting more and more impossible to turn back. After that, Elliot returned home in that manner. Drunkenness had taken hold of him. George could have been roused from his slumber by the commotion emanating from the entrance and the objects he tipped over. I was aware, though, of how difficult it was for George to reawaken. As a result, I bolted from my room and headed over to see Elliot. I was standing directly behind him before I even had a chance to straighten my outfit. There was a hint of a smirk on Elliot's lips, and his eyes were slightly averted. "Are you serious, Darlene?" Was all he could say. Even though he was drunk, his words were genuine. Gathering my strength, I reached out and grasped his arm. "Hey Elliot, hurry up. This is not the way to ascend the steps. Let us remain silent." However, Elliot stared directly at my face the whole time. As his eyes gently swept over me, he cracked a gentle smile. "I must say you are very stunning. I thought you were always this way. Or perhaps I was too preoccupied to pay attention." I momentarily froze, but then I composed myself. "That is sufficient, Elliot. Head on over to the kitchen and I'll brew you a cup of coffee." He was gently guided to the kitchen by me. Something inside me was also unraveling as I tried to calm him down a bit, what with Elliot's stare and all. As I made the coffee, Elliot settled into the chair. Out of nowhere, though, the cup fell from his grasp and landed on the floor. "Elliot, you should exercise greater caution." I tried to wipe up the mess as fast as I could while whispering. All Elliot did was smile gently. "Have you always been so kind?" I swept the kitchen in a rush. "The time has come for us to leave." George was sound asleep upstairs, but he couldn't risk waking Elliot up with his current condition. "Okay, let's head upstairs." With my arm wrapping over his and pointing him toward the stairs, I cautioned him to be quiet. Even more wobbly gait was evident when we entered his room. He was too drunk to get dressed on his own, even though he knew he had to. I considered turning around at first, but my instincts kicked in and I helped him remove his shirt. Elliot stopped breathing as I went to press the buttons on his shirt. The atmosphere was thick with animosity between us at that very time. It grew much more intense amid the stillness. Even though I had no clue, I was well aware of what I was doing. In a new way, Elliot was staring at me. There was no turning back the clock on this, it was just one of those moments. While changing into his new clothes, Elliot paused. He relaxed his grip on the steering wheel and met my gaze directly. My respiration had accelerated at that point. The air was so thick with stillness that it was hard to catch one's breath. "Darlene, I'm out of this game now," he declared with an initially gentle but ultimately confident tone. I didn't budge an inch while I stared at him. I felt my heart racing. So what exactly was Elliot getting at? "Is that so?" His voice slightly deepened as he added, "Are we done? We caught each other once. Is it completely irrelevant to you? You think about it right before you go to sleep, I know that." I retreated a few steps as a cold shudder went through me, but my feet wouldn't budge. "No, Elliot, this is wrong," I whispered, my voice quivering. Elliot had an unnatural grin as he grinned slightly. "The time for us to decide what's right has long since passed, Darlene. Give up being a liar." After that, he advanced a step. And yet another. I could almost feel his breath on my flesh now that he was so near. His fingertips delicately traced over my cheek as he extended his arm upwards. It was hard for me to look away. In my heart, I understood he was correct. As a result, Elliot and I locked lips. An absence of sound. With all that stress, that was the moment that held the key to everything. All of a sudden, the reverberating ideas in my head died down. As my uncertainties fade into hushed tones, I had given in to Elliot's advances. I had never intended to be honest. Even though my hands were shaking, I refrained from pulling away. Nothing could have been hidden from me once I beheld the unwavering resolve in Elliot's eyes. Slowly, I slipped the straps of my garments off my shoulders after swallowing and taking a deep breath. "I agree with you, Elliot." My voice was scarcely audible as I whispered, "We should stop wasting time on this." Reducing the space between us to a minimum, I reclined on the bed. There was no going back now, no matter how much my heart was beating. Grasping me, Elliot drew near. He smiled after staring into my eyes for an extended while. He spoke in a soothing, comforting way, telling me not to be scared. No mistakes have been made. A chill went down my spine and I averted my gaze. The amount of time I had spent anticipating this moment was obvious, even though I was unable to acknowledge it to myself. The words continued to flow freely from my tongue, though. I whispered to Elliot, "I'm a little scared," as my breath became irregular, due to a handful of major factors. I whispered to Elliot, "I'm a little scared," as my breath became irregular, due to a handful of major factors. In response to my words, Elliot seemed to like it, grinning and ignoring me. Perhaps he was intoxicated. "George mustn't wake up," Elliot whispered into my ear. Silence was required and I understood what he meant. How did it happen? But I felt a tremendous pressure within me, and I restrained myself from expressing it loudly. "I know," Elliot said as he glanced at me. "Everything is wonderful and you are wonderful, Darlene." Does he have any idea? I believe he understood me and made an assumption. I squinted because I couldn't resist. The covers were clutched to my body as I shivered and spasmed. So as not to make a peep, I cupped my palms over my lips. Because of his intoxication, Elliot had lost all sense of reality. Actually, even this was having a significant impact on me. The thrill of the occasion mingled with all the other factors, along with the overwhelming sense of significance. Elliot was exhausted, delirious, and gasping for air. I told Elliot that we needed to move quickly since you're red. "Okay," Elliot replied. "Okay," he replied. Still, he persisted in his original course, plus an additional amount. After another contraction, I lost all interest in anything. Even I had lost touch with who I was. I whispered to Elliot, "Anything you want," as I shut my eyes. "Do as you please." Since Elliot relinquished control, it must have been enjoyable for him. Totally, he released himself. Plus, that was excessive. It was unbearable, the inside heat. I hurriedly covered Elliot and set him down on his bed. Next, I secured the door to his bedroom. Just what I needed. A peaceful shower to unwind in. I was completely unprepared for what lay ahead. What had occurred just now? While I was thinking about it in the shower, I experienced a mix of nervousness and unease. However, my thoughts were much clearer when I emerged from the building. In a strange way, I felt at peace. Not even I could be angry with myself. I was completely at ease mentally and physically. As if nothing had transpired, I quietly got dressed, made my way to my bed, and proceeded to sleep. However, in reality, this was merely a brief burst of enthusiasm, an overwhelming surge of careless need. It was never that easy, though. What about this? Neither was this going to remain easy. There was more to come. I don't think it could. Things of a larger nature transpired. Stuff that's more intense. And George would discover the truth in the end. This is just the beginning. Do not miss a thing by not following and subscribing. Make a note and enable alerts. For these tales, it helps to stay ahead of the curve. We greatly appreciate your support. I appreciate you taking the time to listen if you have reached this point.